We are recording this week's episode just a few days before Thanksgiving, so let's talk about being thankful. We should give thanks. Before Jesus went to the cross, he gave thanks. This week we're going to look at that account when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, and we're going to be looking into the benefits of giving thanks and what we should be thankful for. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Ears to Hear. Again, we'd like to thank you for joining this week. Andrew, how are you doing today?
John, I'm doing well.
Good. So, like I said in the intro, it's just a few days before Thanksgiving for us. So, you had the idea, maybe we should actually talk about being thankful.
Yeah, on this Thanksgiving edition of Ears to Hear.
There you go. So, in thinking about that idea of thankfulness, like I said, I wanted to look at the account of the Lord's Supper, and this is Matthew. Matthew chapter 26, and I thought we might start just by reading it together. This is Matthew 26 at verse, Matthew 26 verse 26. It says, "As they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And then he took the cup and gave thanks, and gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.' And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives." I touched on this just a little bit in Sunday's sermon, just the fact that with everything Jesus was facing, that he stopped and he gave thanks. Yeah. And it's just an amazing thing that even in that situation, as Judas was getting ready to betray him, and as we can tell from the parallel accounts, the disciples are about to argue about who's the greatest. Mm-hmm. And yet, in the midst of all that, Jesus still gave thanks. So, Andrew, how do we want to approach this topic?
Well, obviously, giving of thanks is something that, God saw as important for his people. It was something that his son exemplified. So it just got me thinking, and especially, we understand that there's not really any ordained religious holidays that we observe from the New Testament that were given to us by Jesus. And yet, Thanksgiving being an annual holiday does make us think about, and made me think about, what are some of the benefits of giving thanks? What are some of the reasons why Jesus would do it, and hence why we ought to do it?
Yeah. Concerning that topic, by the way, I'll say this. I don't think we need an ordained holiday to give thanks. And I don't think that it's wrong for a people to pick a day out of the year to give thanks.
Yeah, certainly not.
That actually happened in the Old Testament at the end of the book of Esther, when the Jews defeat their enemies and they proclaim a holiday. And that ends up being remembered, and it's talked about throughout Scripture. It wasn't, from Mount Sinai, God saying, "Thou shalt remember this day."
Right. It
was a day that the Jews said, "We are going to remember this day." And it was a good thing, and we should be thankful. So this Thursday, we're going to be thankful, and Friday too, and Saturday too, and Sunday too. But especially Thursday, we're going to be giving thanks.
Yeah, it helps to prompt us maybe to think on things maybe that we hadn't before, or the fact that it gives us some time to consider the year that's passed, the year since maybe we had given it an equal level of thought. So it's a good thing. The first thing I had thought of when it came to some of the benefits of giving of thanks is really just the point that I think Jesus exemplifies in his giving of thanks, which is it gives us humility. It points us in the direction of acknowledging our status and humbling ourselves. When we are thankful for something that has been done for us or given to us, it's not a matter of what we deserved or earned.
Right.
Even though we're thankful for the wages that we earn, maybe with the work that we do, or we're thankful for the success of something that we put our hands to. Giving of thanks is also for things that we had no part in, but were still bestowed to us, that were still given to us, even if we were undeserving or didn't work for it.
When we recognize, when James talks about God, that he's the giver of all good and perfect things. And just the fact that you give thanks implies that you are looking beyond yourself.
Right.
And you're looking at the giver. And we know who the giver is. And it is God. And he is the giver of all good and perfect things. And it turns our mind away from ourselves as we count our blessings, and we are thankful towards the giver. Even Jesus, here he is, he's the Son of God, and yet he gave thanks, and he's turning the disciples towards the Father.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, guys, we need to be, as we think about, especially in that context of the Lord's Supper, and it's this is my body and this is my blood. Well, that does not happen outside of John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And the disciples, as they're about to argue about greatness, they needed to be reminded that be thankful to God. And even Jesus gave thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And these things he's trying to turn them towards the Lord.
Yeah. Being thankful is something that forces us to acknowledge what our status is. And it's hard to boost oneself up and be thankful, truly thankful at the same time. It makes me think of when Jesus talked about the man praying, the Pharisee who was praying. And what did he say? He said, I thank you that I'm not like other men.
Right.
I thank you
He was thankful, wasn't he?
Well, he said he was being thankful.
In the wrong sort of way.
In completely the wrong sort of way, because he knew
Right.
people were watching. That idea of being self-aggrandizing or self-promoting and also being thankful, it's very, very hard to do. True thankfulness, Jesus giving thanks for the simple bread that was the emblems before them, Jesus also praying to the Father before he was going to be crucified, in stark contrast, like you said, to the apostles, debating their greatness. You can't be thankful and do that at the same time.
Yeah, very, very much so. So it helps in that regard.
Yeah. One more passage
ahead.
to that point that I was looking at was in Luke chapter 17. And this is the account of Jesus who heals 10 people with leprosy.
Yeah.
And then, of course, from the account, he heals all of them. He says, go show yourselves to the priests. And then when they were all cleansed, then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice, and he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered, were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Why was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? And he said to him, rise and go your way, your faith has made you well. And the point there in that passage, Luke calls out the detail of him being a Samaritan.
Yep.
Which, the other, presumably then the others who were healed were Jews. And they, I guess, felt that by their status, they had earned it. By their status, they didn't need to give thanks because they were God's people.
And Jesus calls them out on it.
And he calls them out.
Yeah. It's kind of a scathing indictment against them and a heap of praise on the Samaritan.
It is. It's hard to imagine what would go through someone's mind to be healed of an incurable disease and then not be grateful for it.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine that mindset. And yet it's the one who's willing to be humble and the one who's willing to say, I'm giving praise to God because my situation is so far below him, and yet he's helped me with this.
To look at that concept, I think that's one reason, of all the lessons we try to teach children from a very early age. It's like if someone does something good for you or if someone gives you, a gift, say thank you.
Right. And
it's just, frankly, it's just polite. We don't want them to do it just because out of politeness.
Yeah.
It's like, be thankful.
It's polite, but it's about realizing that things aren't all about you.
Yeah.
And that you need to be conscious of things that are outside of just you.
And it's like, don't just take the gift and run.
Right.
And these 9 Jews there, they took it and ran, frankly. And it's the Samaritan who turns around and praises God and gives thanks. And Jesus recognizes it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good idea, good point. What else do we need to talk about, Andrew?
Well, other benefits of giving thanks. The next one I had on my list was, it keeps us from misusing what we've been given. That which we're thankful for and that which we treasure, we tend to take care of. And so when God blesses us with things that He expects stewardship of, an attitude of thankfulness is one that will lead people to be smart with how they handle it. I don't know if the idea of the servants being given the talents, the parable that Jesus told,
Right.
I don't know how thankful they were for the amount of money that the master entrusted each of them with, but He praises the ones who are good stewards of that which they were given. I would think that there would be maybe some that reflects an attitude of at least appreciation to the master.
It seems like in a recent podcast we referred to, and this might be my imagination. We're talking about can't remember if I'm remembering correctly or not, if that even makes sense. Those who won the lottery, win the lottery, and the statistics are amazing that a good many of them end up losing it all.
Right.
And it's, well, how could you do that? And I think it somewhat goes to your point where we should be thankful for our blessings. And sometimes if we are not thankful, we end up abusing our blessings.
Yeah.
And we take them for granted. And rather than using them in a good way, we, it's cheap to us.
Or even abusing them or degrading our blessings because we're not satisfied. I'm thinking of a point that was also recently made. I don't recall. I think it was maybe in a class or a sermon where, who's often people who are the victims of us lashing out if we are angry or if we, don't have a good attitude about things. Who's usually the first to suffer? It's usually the people closest to us, people in our own families. And, the fact that can come from not being thankful for, stepping back and being thankful for the people in our lives, the people who are close to us.
Right.
We tend to abuse things if we're not thankful for them.
Yep, very much so. And even here, as we began by reading from Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper, and I know the disciples are going to argue about greatness, and there are layers to that onion, and some things you just have to speculate on. But Judas was there. Was Judas thankful for the blessings that he had? It's like, no, he was a thief. He would steal from the treasury box that they had.
Mm-hmm.
And here Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper. It's like Judas heard with his own ears, this is my body. This is my blood, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. Like Judas heard those words. And was he thankful for them? No, I don't think he was.
Mm-hmm.
If he was truly thankful for them, he wouldn't have departed from there and betrayed Jesus.
Yeah, his eye was set on future gain that he thought he could achieve, and he was willing to throw away the much greater blessing that was right before him.
He was literally abusing the gift he had, which was Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, that's what happens when we're not thankful.
Yeah, I remember we had a storybook, picture book as children of Aesop's Fables, Aesop being the Greek philosopher. And I always remember one because I can remember the pictures associated, but it's a dog crossing a bridge with a bone in his mouth, and he sees the reflection of another dog with a bone, and he wants the bone that he doesn't have, so when he lunges for it, he drops his own, and he's left with nothing.
What's the moral? Every Aesop fable had a moral.
The moral is, to be grateful for what you have, to not be greedy for what you don't have.
It's like we know what the Bible says: godliness with contentment is great gain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important for us to make sure we're not abusing and found good stewards of our blessings. What other points do you have on your list?
Well, the other one, which I think we briefly started to touch on, is how thanksgiving and being thankful not just to God, but to people around us and one another, showing thanks and saying thank you to people is a strong way to mend conflict. It's a way to improve relationships between people. And it really makes people more connected with one another and brings people closer together by having that sharing of appreciation and showing of appreciation.
The very word, in thinking about Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper, the communion,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like that very word communion means fellowship.
Right.
That's how it's the same word.
Yeah.
And that idea of bringing people together. And again, it's like here the disciples are arguing about greatness. When they do that, that's not the first time they do it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we come together and we're thankful, and I mean, you know how it is, and I know how it is. I'll just speak from my own perspective, that when I'm aggravated with people, and when I'm aggravating two people, which funny enough does happen sometimes. Not looking for a name.
No,
Andrew,
not
don't
you.
you dare amen that. But when you take the Lord's Supper, it makes you pause.
Yep.
And it makes you realize one body, and we are in this together.
Mm-hmm.
And it brings us together. And it's like, stop fighting, stop arguing, work it out, and recognize the fellowship that we have. And the disciples are arguing about greatness, and Jesus is like, "Are you guys kidding me?" And we look to the Lord's Supper, but just that idea of it promotes unity.
Right.
And God has always been about unity. I think it's one of those in one of the Proverbs about 7 things God hates. And one of those is the person who sows discord among brethren.
Right.
God promotes unity. He does not like discord.
Mm-hmm.
And so in thinking about, the benefits of giving thanks, it is giving thanks together. And to your point about giving thanks to one another, and it's like, say thank you. When someone does something good, say thank you.
Yeah.
And it's, on some levels, it's just polite, and it's what civilized society does, but it promotes unity with one another.
Yeah. It strengthens the building blocks of people.
It shows you don't take them for granted, for one thing.
Right. It shows you don't take them for granted. You're more likely to be conscious of their well-being and be caring about their well-being if you appreciate and are grateful for them. It makes me think of some of the things that, even in completely secular sociology and looking at how people interact, having a meal together, the act of cooking for someone and having a meal with someone is an incredibly bonding thing. And God talks about, them going house to house, them sharing their bread together,
Right.
them sharing their meals together, hospitality, all of that God talks about in the New Testament. The idea of making music together and singing. Singing, I think, is a crucial part of our worship, because God knew that, our minds are psychologically affected by music and by singing with other people. It's very bonding activity.
Andrew, why do you always have to get ahead of me here? Because at the end of the Lord's Supper, after they partake the Lord's Supper, what do?
They sang a hymn.
They sang a hymn.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, even before he goes to the cross, he stops and he worships. And I should say, they stop and they worship together. And it's like, that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
As they were encouraging, and it's like, what did they sing? I don't know. Could have been one of the Psalms.
Could have been. And incidentally, many of the Psalms, which were used as hymns, were songs of thanksgiving.
Yeah.
They were praise and thanksgiving hand in hand.
Yep.
So all this just to say, sharing together, communing with one another, hospitality, singing, and giving of thanks to one another, showing thanks and appreciation. They're all things that make human connections stronger. And that's true even, as the scriptures would put it, even among the Gentiles, this would be true.
Yeah.
But it's true among God's people too. God knows the mechanisms that bring people closer together. And so he expects those and wants those for his people.
Yep, very much so. On my list, I also included, it helps us to focus on the good.
Right.
And that, as Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper, he could have focused on the negative, and he could have it would have been very easy to focus on Judas and what was going on in Judas's heart. But he was instituting the Lord's Supper for his people, and he tells Judas, whatever you do, do it quickly. It's like that, okay, and Judas is going to end up leaving. But it's not as though Jesus focused on the negatives. He was about to do something, and it just, as we're thankful, he could have gotten caught up in the negative aspects of the cross. You know, just as far as he could have just been miserable, he could have complained, he could have done all sorts of things. But to give thanks,
Mm-hmm.
and he's like, this is my body that's given for you. This is my blood which is shed for the remission of sins. And it's like, what kept Jesus going through the cross? And it's like, I think he had to focus on the good.
Yeah.
He had to recognize the good that was going to come from this. If he lost sight of the good, he would have just given up, I think. It's like he had to focus on the good. And for us, as we give thanks, it is very easy for us to be overcome with all the evil in the world,
Right.
and all the negativity and everything. But then you read through, like Philippians, and it's meditate on those things that are good and holy and lovely and trustworthy and all those things. And when we meditate on those things, lo and behold, what ends up happening is we give thanks. It's when we focus on the negatives that all of a sudden we start complaining, like Israel of old. And it's, why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? And you just think about Israel and, those who complained.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, and they talk about, oh, if we could be back in Egypt, sitting next to the pots that were full of meat. And it's like, do y'all not remember when Pharaoh made you guys make bricks without straw? And it's like, that's what Pharaoh did.
Yeah.
He was killing babies. Have y'all forgotten that? That God judged Egypt, that God parted the Red Sea, that God delivered you and destroyed Pharaoh's armies in the Red Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys are on the way to the promised land, and you're complaining. It's like, guys, focus on the good. It's like, I know you're in the wilderness. I know it's hot. I know you're hungry. I know you're thirsty. I got it. But God's with you. Focus on the good and be thankful. And it's a lesson for us as well.
Right.
That Thanksgiving, it's sort of like a chicken and an egg. Are we thankful because we focus on the good, or by focusing on the good, does it promote Thanksgiving? And it's, 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Yeah.
They just go hand in hand.
Giving of thanks definitely helps because it pulls us out of being consumed in ourselves. It takes us out of ourselves and focusing on self all the time. And whether it's sadness or self-loathing or just, being unsatisfied with how things are.
Or trials, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, however
it's
difficult
like
things
people
are.
are going through horrible things.
Mm-hmm.
But to stop and to focus on, man, there are still things to be thankful for. And it helps us to persevere. On my list, I think we already covered the being thankful helps us to stop fighting.
Mm-hmm.
The disciples arguing about greatness, and it's kind of hard to keep arguing with people when you're thankful. And we mentioned worship as well, that they sung a hymn when the Lord institutes the Lord's Supper, and it's good to worship.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that's what we're doing. I know Sunday I mentioned the verse in Hebrews about let us continually offer the sacrifice of our lips, and we're thankful, and we're thankful continually. And it says that God is well pleased with that, as we are both thankful and we share, and we share with others, and that God is pleased when we do that. And when you really think about it, and you think about, well, why is God pleased when we give thanks and when we share? And it's like, because this is the royal commandment. This is love God and love your neighbor. That's the definition.
Right.
This is foundational. And so we are thankful and we share. Other things on my list I had, just in thinking about when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, it was after they partook of the Passover. And to think about the Passover, and to think about what they remembered when they partook of the Passover. And 1 Corinthians 5 calls Jesus our Passover. And to just go back to Exodus, and you just think about, we are mindful of God's grace, and that the angel of death passed over the house of the Jews there in Goshen, and you just see unmerited favor.
Mm-hmm.
And that how, so many of our blessings, it's like, I understand we work with our own hands, but still, there are plenty of people who work with their own hands who are, it's all by God's grace, is my point.
Right.
It's all by God's grace. We are thankful for all things. When they partook of the Passover, they ate it with a belt on their waist and their staff in their hands, and they were supposed to be ready to go. And I wanted to make the point that, we are thankful for our blessings, and we should. The Lord has richly given us all things, and we appreciate them. We are still pilgrims on this land, on this earth, and we're looking forward to our home in heaven. And while we are thankful in our time here, we have our eye on the prize.
Yep.
That we are not so thankful. We are thankful, but we don't want to stay here.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking forward to something better, and we're mindful of when the Lord returns. Just in thinking about the Passover and what was happening in Egypt while those in Goshen were enjoying God's grace, frankly. We know when the Lord returns, it's going to be Judgment Day for a lot of people, and that's the Lord's doing. What we want to do is we want them to be thankful with us,
right,
before the Lord returns, and that's why we share with them and we share the gospel with them, that we want them to join the Lord before it's too late. And the Passover was actually the new year for the Jews. It was a new beginning for them.
Mm-hmm.
And as we are thankful this year, the year's coming to a close, and we're looking forward to next year.
Right.
And to just think about that idea, what they would do at the Passover, they would cast out the leaven. They would cleanse their house of all the leaven, and it was a new start. And that's, as we are thankful to the Lord, it helps us to be mindful of the sort of people we need to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, we're thankful for the Lord's mercy. And if there's something wrong with our lives, it might show that we're not as thankful as we should be. And part of us being thankful to God is we want to be more like God. We want to be holy as He is holy, and to not abuse His grace that's been shown. Anyway,
yeah.
End rant. That's everything on my list. What else did you have on your list for this discussion?
I think that pretty much wrapped it up for me, but one more thing that I thought of while you were talking. Paul many times in his letters would express thankfulness for people.
Yeah.
He would write to the church and he would say, we give thanks always for...
He'd call them by name.
For you. He would name specific people by name and give
Right.
thanks for them. But the thing he also repeatedly was thankful for was he would say, I'm thankful for your faith. I'm thankful for your good confession, for your...
When I hear that my children are walking faithfully.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So it's not just that we're thankful for people that we like, but he was expressing a thankfulness that they were partakers in the grace of God.
Yep.
In 2 Corinthians 9, he ends that chapter. Of course, he wasn't ending a chapter, but the end of the chapter contains the verses that say, he talks about how they will glorify the approval of the service. They will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel in Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others, while they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God upon you. Thanks be to God for His inexpressible gift. The root of Paul's thanksgiving for them was their confession and their faith and their partaking in that gift. And then he directs it all to God. All thanks goes to God for His grace, for His gift. So, like you said, the people in our lives, whether it's our families or our church family, the status that we have in life, God's provision for us, protection, our health, all things route back to God, and He's the source of what we're thankful for.
Yep. Andrew, look at that passage. It's interesting, just as you mentioned that passage, and we did not plan this. Okay, but this is 2 Corinthians 9, verse 12. This is in the context of a gift that is being sent to Judea.
Mm-hmm.
That's the context of the passage. For the administration of this service not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also is abounding through many thanksgivings to God. And then the verse, while through the proof of this ministry they glorify God for the obedience of your confession. Now, who's the they in that passage? That's the Judean saints.
It's the ones receiving the gift.
And
from them.
From them. From your confession. That's the Christians in Corinth. And it's just amazing to think about our points and to think about what thankfulness does. And on my paper, I don't know if I did these in order, but the idea of thanksgiving brings us together. Were Jews and Gentiles going to be brought together by this?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what was going to happen. Thanksgiving actually turns people towards God, where the Gentiles turned towards God as the gospel went out. It's like, yeah, it's like Jews became Christians, Gentiles became Christians, and they are brought together. It focuses people on the good. And it's like, of all the stuff, there was a famine going on in Judea.
Mm-hmm.
And in Corinth, you had edicts that were going out, in Rome, that it was starting to affect people everywhere. And yet, could they still be thankful regardless of their circumstances? Apparently so. The fourth thing on my list is it puts things in perspective. And you just look at what's going on here, and it just puts everything in perspective. It's like this is the mystery of God revealed. This is the church. This is the wisdom of God manifest, that all of a sudden Gentiles are being added to the kingdom. And it's like, holy smokes, when we are thankful, it helps put everything in perspective. And we're thankful for so many things, but as we start enumerating our blessings and counting our blessings, and it's like they get bigger and bigger and bigger until you start, as Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper, and this is my blood which is shed for many for the remission of sins. How monumental is that sentence?
Right.
And it's like, it doesn't get any bigger than that. Thanksgiving puts everything in perspective. That being thankful helps us to stop fighting. We've been going through 1 Corinthians in class, and what were they doing so much of? They were squabbling like little kids.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of thankfulness in that.
But as Thanksgiving grew, and as others were thankful for them, would it promote peace within the church? I think so. I think that's what it does.
Because they were thankful for what they had received. They were generous. Thankfulness breeds generosity in people. And then their gift to the Judean Christians, he says, would result in an overflowing of more thanksgivings. So thankfulness is not only uplifting to us, it is not only bringing us closer to other people, but it's catching, and it tends to be something that gets passed on.
Yep, very much so. And then ultimately it turns people towards God. And we talked about that they sang a hymn before they went out to the Mount of Olives. Here, as he talks about this thankfulness, and then it ends with thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. And it's like it's worshiping God together and being thankful together. So anyway, I just thought it was interesting that basically you could see all of our points within that passage too. Why didn't we lead with that, Andrew? No, I thought that's a good way to end it, that we are thankful. And we are thankful, this week, and we're thankful every week. But I hope this study's been beneficial for everyone. Andrew, I know you're getting ready to head out of town.
Yeah, pretty soon here.
Yep, so stay safe. I know a lot of folks are traveling.
Hope everybody stays well and stays safe.
Yep, and we are thankful. And we hope and pray that you are thankful as well, and we appreciate you joining us for this week's episode of Ears to Hear. Stay safe, and we hope you tune in next week. Thanks for being with us.